Now let's talk about variable scopes in PHP. So I'm going to create another file, PHP file called scopes. And we've seen, for example, that I can create a variable named value and set it to some value like the string a value. And then I can write a line of code that references that value. And when I load this page, you get what you'd expect. But what happens with a function? Well, let's go ahead and create a function now, and I'll call this output value, and it won't take any parameters, and it's going to echo $value dot break as well. So if you've worked with other languages like JavaScript, for example, you might think that $value here is going to refer to $value here. So we call this a global variable, and in most programming languages, a global variable is accessible directly by any piece of code that lives in the global context. But in PHP, when I try to do this, let's go ahead and call that. So I'm going to call my output value function. When I try to load this in PHP, I actually get an error, undefined variable value, on line 13. So let's look at the line numbers. Line 13 is right here, and so I'm getting an error when I try to echo the value, $value. That's because in PHP, all variables that live inside of a function are inside that scope, and anything that you try to access has to be inside that scope as well. So if I create a parameter like $value and then pass in some value like 3, that's perfectly acceptable. It outputs the value 3 here because the value of the variable value inside of this scope is whatever I pass in. It has nothing at all to do with the value of this variable in the global scope. The fact that they have the same name doesn't mean anything. So for example, I might know a guy named John Smith who lives in Portland, Oregon, and I might know a guy named John Smith who lives in Boston, but those are two different people. Even though they have the same name, they're different people and they live in different states and different cities. This variable here and this variable here, they have the same name, but they're different variables because they live in different scopes. This one is in the global scope. This one is a parameter that's local to this output value function. So it's pretty important to understand what happens. When I exit this function, this value, this variable here, it goes away entirely. Nothing in the rest of the program can access this variable. It's gone when I exit that function. And when I call this function a second time, I get an entirely new variable called value. So the second time I call this function, it's going to go ahead and create a new local variable called value that only lives inside this function and then goes away when I exit the function. So what happens if I actually want to access the value of this global variable from inside my function, which is sort of the default behavior in most programming languages? Well, you can do that in PHP in a couple of different ways. The first way to do it is go ahead and tell PHP that value is global. This tells PHP that I'm going to access a variable, but the variable I want to access is not local to this function. It's actually the one in the global scope. And that actually works. So I get a value, which is the value of this variable here. And it's just ignoring the parameter I pass in because I don't have a parameter to match it. I can also get the same effect by using something called a superglobal. So there's a superglobal in PHP called $globals in all caps. And the difference between a superglobal and a regular global is superglobals really are available in any piece of code. I don't have to declare this thing as being a global variable inside my function to access it. So we already saw $under_get is a superglobal, and that can be accessed directly in any piece of code. Same thing with this global's superglobal. What this is actually an array of values. It's an associative array. And so I can access the value of $value like so by putting the name of the variable in. So $global's square bracket the name value is the same thing as global $value. And I get the same output. So those are two ways to access global variables, but that said, it's generally considered bad programming practice to include global variables. The reason is because if you have multiple functions that are all touching the same global variables, it becomes very difficult to figure out for a particular line of code why the global variable has a particular value. You have to know how you got to that line of code, not merely where you are. And so generally, you should avoid using global variables. Global constants are okay though. So for example, if I want to define value name, let's go ahead and put that in quotes. Value name is the string value. Now I can use this constant in here like so. And I'm going to get the same result. So constants are accessible from any piece of code just like superglobals are. Any piece of code that I run inside this file is going to be able to access this one constant value. And constants are generally encouraged. The big difference between a constant global and a variable global is that constant values never change. So I always know what this value is going to be. I never have to track back through my program to figure out why this thing has a particular value that's causing me a problem. It's always only ever going to have one value, which is defined right here, and so this is not going to lead to any problems later on. Whereas if I'm accessing a global variable like $value, this whole thing, then I have a problem if the value that I get coming back doesn't match what I expected, because it could potentially be any of the functions that access this global variable that cause a problem. Global variables are bad. Local variables are the default in PHP. You can access a global variable using the global keyword or using the globals, $global, super global. And then there's one other kind of variable that we have in PHP that's kind of interesting. So let's go ahead and I'm going to declare something to be a static called count, which is equal to 0. And then I'm going to echo count with a break. Now watch what happens when I call output value multiple times. So output value, and then output value, do that 7 times. Look at the output I get. So I get 0, 0, 0, 0, not particularly interesting. But watch what happens when I change this. So I'm going to increment the value of count after I've output it. It goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So what it's done is it's actually remembered the value of count on successive calls to output value. That's different from if I hadn't included that static keyword here. So now I just get 0, 0, 0, 0. So every time I enter output value, it creates a brand new count variable, initializes it to 0, outputs it, sets it to 1. But then when I exit output value, this variable goes away completely, and a brand new one is created when I call this function again. By putting static here, it actually remembers this variable across function calls. So this only gets created once, actually at compile time. The variable gets initialized once when it's created, but then every time I call output value, I'm getting exactly the same count static variable. And so when I increment it in one function call, that's remembered, and I get the new value the second time through, gets incremented, new value third time through, and so on. So static variables are sort of like global variables in that a global variable remembers its value across different functions. But I know that the value of count is only going to be accessed or changed inside of this function, so I don't have to quite worry about how I ended up with a particular value here. So static variables are considered good practice as well when you need them. So that's really everything you need to know about variable scoping. You have global variables, local variables, and static variables that remember their value.